this feel like the Disney version?
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Journalism and Free Speech, the China Stories. I'm Jeremy Goldkorn, Editor-in-Chief of the China Project and one of the organizers of this event. I first went to China in 1995. At that time, there was a small press corps in Beijing, a few small bureaus of the major American and British newspapers, some TV news and radio stations. I think there was one Brazilian correspondent, and a handful of freelancers who had a journalist visa through a trade publication like, Plastics Monthly, and wrote for a few different outlets. A job teaching English took me to China, but by 1997 I was working for an independent print publication in Beijing. It was an English language weekly guide to arts and entertainment. So I started to get to know all the foreign journalists in town. Most of them were British, American, and other European men, white men mostly. There were a handful of white women. In the 1990s and early 2000s, I remember Melinda Liu, Cheryl Dunwu, and Lena Sun stood out as ethnic Chinese reporters working for Western media, all women. And then there was Jaime Flor Cruz, a Filipino man who, remarkably, was the Beijing bureau chief of CNN. But what I'm saying is that most of us who were telling the stories and shaping the narratives about China, most of us were white, foreign-educated men. It reminded me a little of some words the sinologist Simon Leys said in connection with debates about sinology. In an essay called rather sarcastically The China Experts, he criticized some Western scholars of China who had written in uncritical support of the Cultural Revolution. And they had to eat their words or just change the subject when the Cultural Revolution ended and Chinese people themselves started talking about how horrible it had been. Perhaps we should not be too harsh on these experts, he wrote. Their fraternity recently suffered a traumatic experience and is still in a state of shock. Should fish suddenly start to talk, I suppose that ichthyology would also have to undergo a dramatic revision of its basic approach. So to be clear, most of the speakers today after me and Professor Westad, most of the audience, you're the fish, and it is absolutely amazing that you're speaking up, speaking out, speaking. And that is what we're going to talk about today. What are Chinese journalists talk about? What are they not talking about? What is different about the stories they tell from the stories the mainstream media used to tell? There are, of course, questions that apply equally to everybody who writes and edits stories about China, no matter where we are from. How do we report on China without censorship or retaliation from the Chinese government? How do we ensure that we maintain a sense of empathy about Chinese people when we tell their stories without being branded communist spies in the United States or other countries? These are very real questions that my organization, the China Project, faces on a daily basis. In the spring of last year, we were attacked by Chinese state media and accused of being agents of color revolution funded by George Soros and the NED, intent on bringing down the Chinese government. And then in the autumn, we were attacked by right-wing forces in the United States and accused of being agents of Communist Party influence. Everyone in this room who works in the news media on China is at risk of the same treatment. If you report with a critical but empathetic mindset on China, that's going to happen, or is very likely to happen at some point. It's frightening, it's horrible, it's awful, but it is also what gets me up in the morning. Because people in China deserve to have their stories told with empathy, and because the Chinese government needs scrutiny and sunlight, and so does China policy in the United States, as well as in Africa, in Australia, in the rest of Asia, in Europe, in Latin America. And because China is too important a story to leave to establishment voices on both sides of the Pacific.